Exactly 2 years ago, in the summer of 2020, the JTA, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency, had an article that discussed a statue in St. Louis. And it said as follows: on the top of a hill, in front of an art museum in the biggest park in St. Louis, stands a statue of an anti-Semite. The monument to the city's namesake, the medieval French king Louis IX, depicts the king astride a horse, wearing a crown and a robe, and holding a sword in his right hand. Erected 116 years ago, that is in the year 1904, in Forest Park, an area in St. Louis, it is one of the city's best-known monuments. Now, a coalition of activists wants it taken down because Louis IX persecuted Jews and led 2 crusader armies in unsuccessful offensive in North Africa, which had implications for the Muslims. A petition launched last week is calling on the city not only to take the statue down, but also to change the city's name. A group of local Catholics, on the other hand, is defending the statue. So there's been a lot of noise about statues in this country. Not many of them relate to Jews. This one does. St. Louis is a very prominent American city, and it's named after a particular individual, Louis IX. He was a king of France in the 13th century. And as we just saw, he persecuted Jews, and there are some people who want his statue to come down, and they want the name of the city to be changed. So what is this persecution of the Jews that they're referring to? So this takes us back to the year 1240 and to a very sad story that took place in the year 1240 and a few years thereafter, and it culminated in an event that happened this week on the Jewish calendar, namely in the week of Parshas Chukas. The week of Parshas Chukas. The story, B'Kitzer, goes as follows. There was a Jew who, at a certain point, fell out of favor, or didn't feel comfortable anymore in the Jewish community. And as it seems from the sources, he adopted some points of view of the Karaim. The Karaim is a group that existed during the Middle Ages. Very few of them survive today, that rejected the Talmud, the Mishnayos, and Chazal, and they had a different way of interpreting the Torah. So it seems that this Jew appreciated their approach more. However, he was living in France, and in France you didn't have Karaim. You had Karaim, you had in the Middle East you had Karaim. In some other communities you had, but in France and in Germany, in the Ashkenazi communities, we don't really know of them having any Karaim. So he didn't really have a community to attach himself with. This was a little bit of a problem. And he decided that he's going to actually go to battle against the Jews. And what he did was, he sent letters to the Pope at the time saying that the Gemara is a terrible thing. And it says all these terrible things in the Gemara, and you should make an investigation. Now today, there are documents that survive in Latin from the Pope and from some of the monarchs in Europe that are discussing this issue from that year, from 1240, and that's how we know this information. Basically, what the Pope did was he sent letters to all of the kings in Europe that had Jews. He said, I hear some complaints against the Talmud. You need to make an investigation. You need to look into this. As far as we know, from the advent of Christianity until that day, which is a very long time, around 1200 years, there never was this government-led investigation into the Gemara. There were, to be sure, always arguments on how to interpret different passages in the Torah, this kapitel in Tehillim, this chapter in Yeshaya. But getting involved in what it says in the Gemara, and is it kosher, is it not kosher, we don't have records of this happening prior to this. Most of the kings in Europe ignored what the Pope had to say, but the king in France was very frum. He was frum in his religion, which is why he was ultimately made a saint, which is why the city is called St. Louis. There aren't many kings that were made saints, but he had a very strong religious identity, and he took this very seriously. And so he called for an investigation of the Gemara to happen in his country, in France. And in the year 1240, there was a major confrontation that happened, and where the Rabbanim were invited to come defend the Gemara against the accusations. It's not entirely clear all the details that went down during this time, but there are some basic things and basic facts that we know. And that is that the Rabbanim were led by one of the famous Balei HaTosfos. This is still in the era of the Balei HaTosfos, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, who's quoted many times by his students, and many in different Tosfos, and he's quoted from time to time as well. He was a great scholar, obviously, but it also seems that he also had experience in dealing with outsiders and talking to non-Jews about the Jewish religion, which not every rabbi always has that experience. And so he was appointed as to be the leading advocate for the Jewish community at this time. And there was a confrontation presided over by not Louis himself. Louis himself appointed his mother. His mother was the queen mother. Her name was Blanche. And because Louis became a king when he was very, very young, so she was running the country for a number of years. And even when he got older, he would delegate to her many different achrayasin, including this task of leading this investigation. And so we have accounts of accusations that are made by this person whose name is Nicholas Donin. Nicholas Donin is the one who makes the accusations. And Rabbi Yechiel of Paris is doing the defense. And it's presided over by this queen mother, Blanche, the mother. Now, there are two accounts of these discussions. One is in Latin, that was written in that generation, and has been preserved in Paris to this day. And that's the non-Jewish version of what happened. And then there is a Jewish version written in Hebrew that was written also soon after this whole story happened. And there are many similarities between the accounts. There are also many differences between the accounts. Obviously, we're going to be reading from the Hebrew account and getting a little bit of a taste of the issues that came up. So let's begin by looking at toward the beginning of this disputation. We have the following.
Is each one leaning towards their side, like the Latin one more towards the Christian side and the Jewish?
Yes. So obviously each one is written from its perspective. We also have to remember that I can't talk for the Latin version, but the Jewish version wasn't written as where the goal was to just have a document that reflects what happened. It was written for future use. It was written for Jews who are going to be facing similar situations, how they should be thinking about this and talking about it or whatever. So, we definitely know that it reflects reality. The question is, were parts buttressed and it's very, very possible that things were added in order to help for future generations. Okay, so we have, toward the beginning,
this time all the Gemaras were handwritten, there was no printing yet, right?
Very good point. At this point, all the Gemaras were handwritten, manuscripts. Yes, that's going to have implications for later on. Yes. Printing develops, the first printing of the Gemara happens in the 1480s. Okay, way after this. So let's go. What happens is that Rabbi Yechiel of Paris turns to the queen and says the following. He says, please don't force me to answer these accusations. You know why? Because there's something very powerful in precedent. Ki Talmud yashan noishan. I'm reading the second passage. Ki Talmud yashan noishan. What he's saying over here is as follows. The Talmud, the Gemara has been around for many hundreds of years. No one had a problem with it. And he quotes here, and Rabbi Yechiel of Paris did his homework, and he knew his stuff. He quotes one of the most famous church fathers, who's known as Jerome. Jerome wrote the Bible, translated the Bible into Latin. The first translation of the Bible into Latin was done by a non-Jew. He lived in Eretz Yisrael in the 4th century, and he translated into Latin. He's one of the church fathers. He spoke with Jews. He knew everything about Jews. He never said anything negative about the Talmud. Hieronymus Hagalach Yada Kol Toreseinu V'Chol HaTalmud Kashar Noida LaChol Hagalachis V'Im Haya B'Doifi Loiham Haya Manichai Ad Koi. He never would have allowed it to exist had there been any problem there. And he goes on to say, all these centuries of many great scholars, Catholic scholars, none of them had a problem with this. Shouldn't that really put this whole issue to rest? And we don't even have to go into the specifics because I have a very strong argument just from this precedent. Well, and then he goes on to say in the next paragraph that the only reason why we're standing here today is because of Bishvil HaChoyte Halaz, and here he points us to Nicholas Donin, because of this sinner, Asher Kafar B'divrei Chachamenu, who denied what our sages said for the past 15 years. There's different versions on what it's supposed to say over here, but it seems the preferred version is that for the past 15 years, he basically has been denying Chazal. He only believes the 5 books without any interpretation, right? That point of view that says, I don't accept any interpretations. Whatever it says in the Torah, I accept, nothing else. That's a Karaite point of view. But you know, he's arguing to the authorities, every text needs interpretation. There's no such a thing as I accept a text without any interpretation. Every text needs some degree of interpretation. Va'alkein, we learn here, hivdal nuhu vini du nuhu. We have separated him and we have excommunicated him. So here we're getting this information that 15 years before the year 1240, the year 1225, this Nicholas Donin was excommunicated by the Jewish community because he had Karaite tendencies, and that led to the problem where he made these accusations, which is why we're standing here today. For those past 15 years, he's been trying to plot evil against us in order to uproot everything. You can have a conversation here about the power of excommunication and nidui, because this is not the only case in Jewish history where a nidui kind of backfires. On the one hand, what are you supposed to do? Someone is espousing views that are dangerous, that go against the values of the community, so the person should be excommunicated. On the other hand, what sometimes happens when a person is excommunicated is you kind of force them to fight you even stronger. This is not the only example where this happens, just something to think about. Yep. Okay, so ultimately, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, Rabbi Yechiel's argument was not accepted. They said, no, we do need to get into the issues, we need to get into the specifics. Now, when you read the entire Hebrew account, you see that the charges against the Gemara are broken down into 4 categories. Category number 1 is Jewish law makes no sense, meaning Jewish law as explicated in the Talmud makes no sense. Argument number 1. Argument number 2 is going to be there are blasphemies against the founder of Christianity and against Christians. Number 2. Number 3, Jewish law calls for Jews to act immorally toward Christians, to take advantage of them and to hurt them. Accusation number 3. And accusation number 4 is about Agadata, that the Agadas in the Gemara, the Midrashim, the non-legal sections in the Gemara contain a lot of nonsense. And so therefore, these are the 4 accusations that were made. He brought many different proof texts for each one of them, and Rabbi Yechiel had to go and answer each one. We're going to do one text, we'll do one sample from each of these 4 categories. Ultimately, where he was going with this, and where the Pope was going with this, if it is true that the Gemara is doing any of these 4 things, then the Gemara cannot be tolerated in a Christian society. In a society that's not pluralistic, in a society that gives rights to Jews only on condition that, well, this is not going to be an acceptable condition. And Nicholas knew that, which is why he's bringing these claims against them. So let's look at the first category. The first category is halacha and Jewish law, and here he brings the din of moilech. The account, just to give you a flavor of how the Hebrew is written, look at the account where it says, Vayiftach ha'asoin es pi vayomer. And the donkey opened his mouth and said, it reads very polemical. It reads like it's engaged in a serious war. Okay, what does he go on to say over here? We know the Torah has a din of moilech. What's moilech? Moilech is a person who takes their children and passes them through or over fire, and this is a form of worshiping Avodah Zarah. You're not allowed to do it. You're not fine. The Torah, in fact, says that there is a death penalty for a parent who does this. Fair enough. Comes along the Gemara and says, if you look at the Lashon HaPasuk, it says, Umizaracha lo yitain la moilech. From your children, you shouldn't give to moilech. Oh, so what do Chazal say? Chazal make a deal. From your children, of your children. In other words, what's the Isser? The Isser is when a person has 5 children and he gives 2 over to moilech, that's a problem. But if someone took all 5 of their children and passed them over to moilech, that's not of your children, that's all your children. There is no death penalty for this. So he says, this makes no sense. Umi yamin lezois. Who could believe this? Sheim hever ksas mizare chayev misa. That if you used some of your children in this service. You're chayav misa. V'im hir balachtoi, but you did a bigger avera. V'hever kol zaroi, and you did all of your children. As yiftar mi misa. V'yakumu ha'agmoinen l'tzachek. The bishops got up and they all laughed. V'gam ha'malka nifla'a, and the queen mother Blanche, also was very surprised. It actually is interesting that this account doesn't have her laughing, which presents her, and there are other indications when you read the whole thing, that she's actually more moderate. She's balanced, that she's serving her role as the judge and trying to be balanced and not between. And so you see that here, and you see this in other places. But it's a very, very powerful question. What is this business of this din, which sounds very awkward, by Melech? So Rabbi Yechiel of Paris answered the following, and this answer is actually a very interesting yisoid, and actually opens a very interesting examination of how punishments work in the Torah. What he explained, he said, I want to tell you what's going on when we have in Torah oynish, skila, sreifa, hereg, and chenek. I'm sorry I don't have enough handouts. It's due to the numbers last week. But, okay, next week we'll bring more. There's skila, sreifa, hereg, chenek. It says, when the Torah does this, why is the Torah doing this? There are many different motivations why a society may want to put someone to death. Sometimes it's, we're angry at him. Sometimes it's, we want a retribution. Sometimes it's, we want to prevent other people from doing this, right? There's many different motives in why a society chooses to punish a person. It says, why does Torah have punishments? The Torah punishments, and including Misa, they have one objective. Kapara, for the offender. It's very interesting. It's about the offender. We want to help the offender. And it brings a kapara to the offender. And he brings a case where Chazal Darshan, this is the story of Achan and Yerichai. Yerichai, the Jews were not supposed to take loot. There was a Yid, Achan, who did take loot. And because of that, he was put to death. And when Yeshua was speaking to him, Yeshua told him that Yarkecha Hashem b'yoim hazeh, that you are going to be an outcast today. And the idea is today, or troubled, I think is right. You're going to be troubled today. Today, but not in Olam Haba. In other words, why? Why you're not going to be troubled in Olam Haba? Because the very fact that we're going to put you to death for this Aveira is going to bring you kapara, and so you're going to have Olam Haba like every other Yid. So it says, once you understand that Yisoid, so if someone does a small Aveira where he takes one child and passes over to the Melech, he can say, okay, we're going to put the father to death, and he's going to have thereby a kapara for his nefesh for that smaller sin. When he took all of his children, it's such a great Aveira. So even here, even Torah that wants to offer kapara doesn't have kapara to offer the guy. So what are we going to do? Kill him for no reason? This is what Rabbi Yechiel answered. Now, what's very interesting about this is that Rabbi Yechiel was not the only rabbi involved here. The Hebrew account gives us the names of another few rabbis. However, they have no speaking role. They're just mentioned as coming, as being part of the commission, but they don't have a speaking role. Who's one of them? One of them is actually relatively famous, Rabbi Moshe of Kutzi. Rabbi Moshe of Kutzi. Kutzi is a place in France. Rabbi Moshe was one of the Balei HaTosfos, but he's most famous for writing the Sefer Smag, known as Smag, Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol. Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol. What did he do? In a nutshell, we spoke about him in the past. He saw the Mishnah Torah Rambam, and he said, wouldn't it be a wonderful idea to take this and break it down into 613 mitzvahs divided by section? He didn't know that the Rambam had already made a Sefer Mitzvahs, because that was written in Judeo-Arabic, which in France they didn't speak that language, so it never came there. So he wrote a Sefer HaMitzvahs based on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah. Okay, good. So this is the Smag. The Smag was one of the Rabbanim that was brought to this to be part of this commissioning. Now, when it comes to the mitzvah of Moilech, look what the Smag says. Number 4, the Yesh Tam. He brings the din, only some of the children, not all of them. Zok the Smag, the Yesh Tam Bazel L'Tshuvas HaMinim. And now I'm going to give you the reason to answer the minim. So in other words, and what does he go on to say?
He said this at the time.
No. He writes this in his Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol. He writes it in his Sefer. Mipnei Shebemizas Bezdin Miskaprim Hamumasin. The person who gave all his children to such a big Aveira, so he gives the same hesber. That's fascinating. Why? We don't have this answer from anyone else. This is the first time in Jewish history where we have this answer being offered. There are other explanations that were given by other Gedolei Yisrael and other times, but this explanation originates in this time and place. The Smag who is involved, brings it in his sefer, and he clearly writes that it's l'tshuvas haminin. He clearly writes that it's to answer the heretic. So it's very reasonable to suggest that he sees the question, he hears Rabbi Yechiel's answer, he realizes this is a relevant issue, and he puts it into his Sefer Mitzvahs Gadol that he eventually authors. And then he adds an interesting twist. We have at the end of Parshas Emor, we have a story where the person was Mekalel as Hashem. And Moshe said, oh, what are we going to do? Put him away, so we're going to ask Hashem what we should do with him. And in the end, the answer was to put him to death. Frek sich the Shaila, was he not sure? There's a din that if a person curses their parents, there's a chiyuv misa. So cursing parents is a chiyuv misa. So Allah has got a person was megadav, he cursed Hashem, of course there's a chiyuv misa. Why is Moshe Rabbeinu even in doubt? Oh, this is a big problem. Everyone wants to know. So he says, now you understand why. Moshe Rabbeinu was in doubt. Of course it's a harber aveira. Of course it's stricter. We know that. The question is, do we want to give him a einish misa which will allow for the kapara, or do you say no? This person is so far gone that I can't even offer that. The Maharsha picked up on this in another, quotes the Smag, quotes this, and he explains thereby another interesting din. Let's say there's a klal in Gemara that's called ein oinshin min adin. Din in this context means a kal v'chomer. I'll give you an example. Shabbos and Yom Tov. Yom Tov is more kal. Shabbos is more chomer, right? So let's say we would say that a person is not allowed to engage on a certain activity on Yom Tov. You're not allowed to pick up a stick on Yom Tov, let's say. Then we say, oh, Shabbos, it doesn't say the din. Oh, but madach, you're not allowed to pick up a stick on Yom Tov. How much more so you're not allowed to do it on Shabbos? Okay, now let's say the Torah specifies an einish for picking up a stick on Yom Tov. So do you carry over that einish to Shabbos as well and say, madach Yom Tov, you're not allowed to pick it up. Shabbos also you're not allowed to pick up. And madach Yom Tov, if you have the punishment of Misa, so too on Shabbos you have the punishment of Misa. Says the Gemara, no, ein oinshim min adin. You don't carry over oinshim through a kal v'chomer. A kal v'chomer is strong enough to tell you something is forbidden. A kal v'chomer is strong enough to tell you something is permitted. It's not strong enough to lift the einesh from the other item into this new story. Why? Why? If that's kal, it's an easier issue. Yom Tov is more kal, and still there's a chiyuv misa for picking up the stick. In my hypothetical scenario, so halachas kama v'kama on Shabbos there should be the. Why do we have this ruling? So Maharsha says, now you understand why. Based on this yesod, because it's stricter. So who says you bring the punishment? It could be the punishment is only effective for kapara in the lower class of the sin, and it's not effective for the kapara in the higher class of the sin. Okay, so really, it created a whole genre. What Rabbi Yechiel did here is he introduced a new way of thinking that I have not seen documented clearly, articulated clearly before. And this was picked up by the Smag, this was picked up by the Maharsha, and it was picked up by others as well. And it's used to explain many other interesting inyan. And one of the things that you emerge from this is with the way I started when I was speaking about this beer, is that it gives you a different perspective on what Unshim and the Torah are doing. Because the fact is, when we read the Torah and we see, for this, there's this punishment, for this, there is no punishment, for this is a different type of punishment. Or, as the Rebbe would then say, and in the Torah there is no prison. Why? Why? Why is there no prison in the Torah? Because prison is an effective tool to protect the society. Torah's punishments are not about protecting society. That's not what Torah's punishments are geared for. Torah's punishments are geared for, someone did something wrong, we want to help him. Which is very different from the way we intuitively think about it, because the way we intuitively think about it is someone did something wrong, so why would you want to help him? But no, Torah says we help everyone, including someone who did something wrong. And that's what a punishment in Torah is. And so therefore, prison is problematic because it's very hard to conceive how prison could be a kapara. When you take someone away from life and you don't allow them to be productive in not physically and not emotionally and in many other ways, it's very hard to imagine how that's kapara. Ir miklat, you see how the whole ir miklat is structured around creating an environment for kapara. You can't have roiv roitzchim in the city. It has to be, most people have to be regular good people, and a Talmud shagala magalan rabbi imoy, you bring the Rebbe, the rabbi with him so that he's learning, he's a good environment. That's conducive for a kapara. So this helps explain what Torah is doing for Unshim. You want to learn how to protect society? Torah's model for that is that's the Melech's job. It's a whole different system, and they make their own rules. It's very, very different from the dinim in the Torah about the chiyuvei and the hasra and all of that. All of those things. It's also hasra is an important thing. People, So the murderer is only going to get killed if he did asra and toich kedei dibur. He said, I don't care that I'm going to be executed for murder. I'm doing the murder anyway. Really? Is you going to run a society that way? How many people in this country who committed the sin of murder? How many of them had hasra? None of them had hasra. Once you understand, no, but it's about kapara. When does a person need that level of kapara? When he had that hasra. And despite the fact that he had that hasra, he said, I'm doing it anyway. Oh my God, now he needs that level of kapara. So he gets that level of kapara. When not, so then it's a different issue. Then you need to protect society. So that's what governments are for, and that's what kings are for, and that's what a Sanhedrin is for. It's a completely different system. I don't want to get stuck too much in this, but I'm just saying that this is a big yesod in Yiddishkeit about how Einish of the Torah works, and this helped explain the issue of moilech to them. And he writes at the end, if you go back to number 3, he writes, the last line, he writes at the end, V'atam hazeh motzachem b'eineihem. You're right, and he doesn't say that for everything. He doesn't say that at the end of each argument. In some arguments we see clearly they didn't accept it. Here it looks like that all the people on the Catholic side of the commission seem to be accepting of this argument. So Ad Kan is the first category of where there's an attack on Torah Sheba'al Peh, on the Talmud in terms of Jewish law. Yeah?
But this Kulam, there's a thing that if all the judges say Chayev,
Yeah,
he goes free, that's in the same category. No, he doesn't have enough. His Zavera is so strong that he doesn't have a kapara. No, let's go weiter. We'll do questions at the end because we mamish have to finish on time. Okay. Next category. The next category was the Talmud contains blasphemies against Christianity. Here, not too difficult. What he did was he brought some Gemara in Gittin, and the Gemara in Gittin basically has a passage in where it says that Onkelos was investigating whether he should convert to Judaism or not. And he brings up in a dream, he brings up the founder of Christianity, and he asks him, what's your situation in the afterlife? And he says that his punishment is that he's soaking in excrement. Now, when Nicholas cited this passage, the Hebrew account goes out of its way to say that he used the French word for excrement rather than the Latin word. So in other words, the Latin word is similar to excrement. It's, the way dignified people talk about that type of thing. You'll say that word. It's in polite society you could say that, right? But then you have the slang or the word on the street, the more of the pedestrian way of saying about it and of talking about it. And he used that word. And the Hebrew account stresses that he did it because he wanted to create that emotional response. Imagine you use the word excrement versus some other curse words, and then you would understand that it's all the more offensive. And so what does Rabbi Yechiel of Paris answer? Rabbi Yechiel of Paris says, you've been saying this for the last 15 years, but let me tell you, this passage in the Talmud, Loi al Elehei hanoisrim dibru kacha. This is not said about the founder of Christianity. Rak al Yeshu achar shehilig al divrei chachamim, v'loi hemin li divrein kamoicha rak hemin b'torah shebiksav. Essentially, he's saying that this was a different Yeshu. This is a Yeshu who was a tzedukah. A tzedukah, like you, Nicholas. Like you, Nicholas. That's what it was. And that's what it's talking about. It's not talking about the same person. Now, the priests that were there, they push back. They say, how can you believe this? You're dividing one into two. You're really saying that there were two separate ones and that they shared similar faiths. Is that really possible to say that? And here he said perhaps one of the most memorable lines in this debate. There's different versions of how it comes out. I think it comes out better where it says, Loi kol Louis hanoladim b'tzarfas malachim b'tzarfas. Not every Louis in France is the king of France. In other words, Louis is a very popular French name. And many of them have similar, they live in the same city and they have the same name. Yeah, it's not up to say that there were two people named Yeshu. Why, and so he defends this. He goes with this all the way. Now, the question that we need to ask when we see this, and he used this. As far as I know, he's the first one to introduce this, and it was used later. Other Rabbanim also use this. No, that passage of Talmud's not talking about the founder of Christianity. It's talking about a different person, different type of heretic with a different name. The question is, to what degree did he genuinely believe this, or was he had no choice? He had to say what he had to say in order to save the Talmud. I don't really have sophisticated thoughts on that, so I'm just going to leave it hanging as a question.
Can you give a backup reason?
Sure. backup reason, or did he justify his? Yeah, he did. He brought arguments to convince. So, for example, one of the things he did was there's a passage in the Talmud about Yeshu that links him with Rabbi Yechiel ben Prachia. Yechiel ben Prachia, we know when he lived, and that's like, I don't know, 100 or 150 years before the Churban Beis Hamikdash. So it doesn't work out with their dates. Now, Ramban addressed the same issue in his debate that happened 30 years or so after this. Less than that. And he said, so it is talking about Yeshu, the founder of Christianity. We just disagree with your dates. But Yechiel of Paris uses that to his advantage and says, no, that proves that it's talking about someone else. I accept your dates. Your dates are good, and that's your guy. And this Talmudic passage, which Yechiel ben Prachia, is talking about a different person. And likewise, he tries bringing other arguments to demonstrate that it's not the Yeshu, the founder of Christianity. Yeah.
Uncle is bring him up if it's somebody else.
I don't know. I don't know. Maybe he was a famous person. I don't know. Okay. Next category. Next category is Jews try to harm Christians. He brings multiple passages from the Talmud in this regard. One of them that he brings is a very famous passage that says, Toiv shebegoyim haroi. This is a very difficult passage. The best of the non-Jews should be killed. What does this mean? How could this passage even be said? So, what Rabbi Yechiel of Paris answered was, that is, as far as I know, it's not a Yavamis. The Mekoides of this teaching are in the Mechilta. It's brought in Rashi, Parshas Beshalach, by Mitzrayim, and as we'll see, it's a Masechah Sofrim. I'm not saying it's not a Yavamis, I just haven't seen it being quoted from Yavamis. So what does Rabbi Yechiel of Paris answer to this accusation? Rabbi Yechiel of Paris answers as follows. Go to Masechah Sofrim. Masechah Sofrim is one of the Masechah Tanos. There's one of these Mishnayos style dinim that were written after the Mishnayos were written, and generally they're regarded as having the category of brisa, they're treated in that way. And when you look at the teaching in Masechah Sofrim, you see that it uses the context of war. It's talking about a war. Why? Because the original, where does the teaching emanate from? Rav Shimon ben Yochai. What did Rav Shimon ben Yochai say? Rav Shimon ben Yochai said that when the Yidden were leaving Mitzrayim, Paroi pursues them with horses and chariots. Frexich the Shaila, where did they get horses from? Wasn't there a Makkah of Dever and Barad that killed all the animals? Well, the answer was, we learned in Parshas Va'era that Hayore es Dvar Hashem, the people who were God-fearing, they knew there's an impending storm, they moved their livestock indoors and they were spared. Oh, so what do you see? That the Yore Midvar Hashem took their animals and started chasing the Jews. That's why, that's the context of the teaching. Toiv shebegoyim haroig. When you're in war, don't say, what do you mean? That guy the other day, he was God-fearing. I don't have to worry about him. You Bevedish have to worry about him. When it's your nation going up against that person's nation, you can't take anything for granted. And this means that you need to be very, very cautious about these types of people. And yes, anytime there's going to end up being a war, it also means that some good people are going to end up being killed. So this is what this is how Rabbi Yechiel of Paris answers this. And then he goes on to say, but us living here, we're not in a war with you. He writes, V'uma sha'anu beineim, the nation that we dwell amongst them now, heim shomer ma'isanu, lach yisenu, they protect us. So anachnu machzikim isur v'oinish lahazikam. We believe this to be forbidden to hurt them. Afilu kumloi chut hasaira, even minimally. Loi begufam, v'loi b'mamoinam, not in body and not in their possessions. Ve al shvichos damim hisidinu al kala umois. We've been commanded against murder because it says loi sirtzach v'loi hivdol bein Yisrael l'shar umois, and there is no difference between Jews and non-Jews in this regard. Suffice it to say that Tov Shebegoyim Haroig, this passage, has gotten a lot of attention. This is one approach. In fact, one time the Rebbe delivered a long sikha on this subject because Rashi brings it in Parshas Beshalach. So in the context of a Rashi sikha, the Rebbe brought it. The Rebbe explained how Rashi wants the Ben Chomesh L'Mikra to understand this. And the way the Rebbe explained it was that Rashi has a different approach to this whole thing. Rashi's approach here is, you're dealing here with God-fearing people. And yet, lo nishar b'hem adechad. Kriyas Yamsuf means that all of them were killed. So it's like talking about what God did. What God did was, Toiv shebegoyim haroi. God punished even the good ones who were in Mitzrayim, good ones, they were Yarei Dvar Hashem, even they were killed during Kriyas Yamsuf. Why? Because they really had intense hate for the Jewish people, even as they were Yarei Dvar Hashem. So it's talking about a specific time, a specific place, and not about what human beings do. It's talking about what God did. That God did this. Okay, then the Rebbe went on to say, why didn't Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, in the debate, why didn't he bring this answer? It's interesting. Why didn't he bring this answer? Such a pashta answer. The Rebbe explained it works in Rashi, but it doesn't really work in the Mechilta and Maseches Sofrim. You look there in the context, it doesn't sound like it's limited to that doyer. And we take a see, Rabbi Yechiel of Paris limits it to war, not to that doyer of war, to any generation of war. Fine. So in other words, Rabbi Yechiel felt that it would be too disingenuous to say the interpretation that the Rebbe said, which works very well for what Rashi is doing. In the language of Rashi, it works very well, because Rashi says, Tov shebe mitzrim haroig, so it works very well for what Rashi is trying to do, but the Mechilta, Maseches Sofrim, kosher, so it doesn't work, and this is the Rebbe explained. As far as I know, this is the only time that Rebbe invoked this disputation. Okay, next category. The next category is Agadata. Here there's a lot, because we know a lot of Agadata could sometimes be strange. And we learned, the Alter Rebbe tells us, that really the secrets of the Torah, the deepest secrets of the Torah are hidden here. So it also means that it's easy to kind of find something bizarre, something that sounds a little zany, and to then attack it. And this is what happened over here. What did he pick on? So I chose a few things, but I chose this week's parsha. Toward the end of this week's parsha, we have the war between Am Yisrael and Og Melech HaBashan. We have very little material in the Torah on this. There's a few psukim. It's not much. But Chazal elaborated on some of the events that happened over there. And there is this medrash that we learned many, many years ago when we were little children about what happened with Og Melech HaBashan. Basically, the Gemara in Brachos describes how he took a mountain that was 3 parsois, uprooted it, and he wanted to drop it onto the Jewish people. However, so I guess the mountain is leaning on his head, something like this, right? He's using his head to prop up this mountain, but then the ants start gnawing in at the point of contact between his head and the mountain, so it becomes soft, and then suddenly the whole thing pops on over his head. So now he's covered by this huge mountain, so he wants to lift it off. He tries lifting it off, his teeth kind of grow out, and they buckle down this mountain, and he can't get it out, and then Moshe Rabbeinu comes and finishes him off. This is what the Gemara in Bracha says. He brings this passage, Nicholas did, to say, who could believe this? Who could believe this? Now, this is a little bit of a funny thing, because what do you mean, who could believe this? Christians don't have funny things that they believe that are also sound out of. So I never really understood this part of it. But let's see what Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, what he does. It's very interesting. What he says is as follows. V'asher sha'alta. This is a Gemara in Brachos. Gemara in Brachos. Daf nun daled amid beis. V'asher sha'alta b'oig melech habashan heach okar har gimel parsois. How is it possible that he uprooted a mountain that is 3 parsa long? Guzman nakat. Don't worry, the Gemara is exaggerating. In fact, we see the Torah doing this. Why? Because the Torah says about cities that are very, very large and tall, walls, cities that are large and that are fortified, reaching the sky. Really? Reaching the sky, like to where the heavenly bodies are floating? No, not there. Because they were very high, and it looked as if they reached the sky, so therefore nakatachi. Even though it's not reality. So too, just as the Torah does it, the Chachamim also did it. Because it was a very big mountain. And perhaps an onlooker looked at it and saw that it would be that size. And you're laughing about his teeth growing. Simply because he was unable to get it off his head. It looked as if his teeth buckled in. What's his answer over here? His answer over here is Chazal, we're trying to give you a basic idea. And notice how he links it to a pasuk in the Torah. Why? Because the second you show that Tanakh does it, they can't argue with that, they accept Tanakh. So the second they realize that Tanakh has it that way, so the Chachamim are just following in the tradition of Tanakh. Notice he doesn't say here that it's a metaphor. Metaphor is an entire different approach. Metaphors mean that you say, Og Melech HaBashan represents a certain madrega, and the mountain represents a certain thing, and you put it on your head represents, and then you try to, we all have that, where we try to fix it, and then it gets worse, right? And you could make a whole thing, an avodah of what this means. The metaphoric approach The Ashkenazim did not use it. The Balei HaTosfos did not use it. This is Sfardim. The Rambam uses this. The Ramban uses it. The Chachmei Yisrael in Sfard, they use this all the time. In Ashkenaz, they did not. This is not that. This is different. This is just saying that it's Derech Guzma. Then he goes further and says, the truth is, I can give you another answer and a better answer. The truth is, God's deeds are even greater than this. You were dealing with the same God that you believe issued the 10 plagues and split the sea. So, if you believe that, do you believe that God couldn't do this? That God couldn't turn this into a miracle, that Oig did all of this? So, in other words, it's very much an option that all of this is not a guzma, it's actually very literal. He doesn't really see why he needs to back away from a literal approach. But he brings it second. He must have felt that it was necessary to have both of these answers. Okay, this is a small taste of one example of each of the 4 categories that we spoke about. What was the outcome of this event? So one of the things we know in the Latin protocols, it says over there that when they said this to Yeshus, they said, we don't accept that. We think that's a lie. They didn't believe it. About the other kindness, not entirely clear what they believed, what they accepted, what they didn't accept. The bottom line is they issued a verdict of guilty. Who's guilty? Not the Jews. The Jews aren't guilty. The Talmud is guilty. And therefore, the Gemara had to be condemned and had to be punished and had to be confiscated. So now we move to an account of someone who lived in that generation who tells us what happened. This is the Shibbolei Aleket. He did not live there, but he lived at this mamish the same time. Tzidkiah ben Avram. He lived in the 13th century in Italy, and he wrote a sefer. Shibbolei Aleket is a halacha sefer, and he writes as follows: because we're already dealing with Hilchas Tainis, Uvinyan Sreifas HaTorah, and we're already talking about the burning of the Torah, which happened during the era of Bayis Rishon, where on Shiva Asar B'Tammuz, one of the things that happened is a Sefer Torah was burnt. So Kasavnu Zeh, so I'm going to write something else, L'Zecher Al Ma She'ira B'Yameinu, so that there's a memory for what happened in our day. And thank God he wrote this, because this account that he writes here is very important. Al Roiv Aveneseinu Asher Gamru Lanu, due to our many sins. The Nisraf HaTorah Salekenu, God's Torah was burnt. B'shnas Chameshes Halafim, V'dalit Shanim L'Brias Olam. In the year 5004 to creation. Just a note about this. I failed to say before, the year of this disputation, vikuach, inquisition, whatever you want to call it, was the year 1240. 1240 is a very important year in the Jewish calendar. Why is that? It's the year, if you want to say, what's this year? This year is year Hey, 5000. We're still in the same millennium from then. It started then. And we also know that, and if you remember, even in non-Jewish calendar it works that way. When you reach a big round number, there's a lot of expectations. There's a lot of enthusiasm. Sometimes there's maybe expectation that maybe this will be the time that Mashiach is going to come. Ultimately, instead of a positive, there's something very negative that happens. So that was the year 1240. So it's the year Hey. So he's saying that in the year Chamesh Alafim V'Dalid, the year Dalid. Now some versions of this have year Beis. So we're not entirely sure. We know when the proceedings happened in 1240, when the burning, which is what we're going to read about now, when that happened is either 1242 or 1244. People have a good time arguing and debating these dates, which is not our concern here. When did it happen? B'Yom Shishi, Friday, Parshas V'Zois Chukas HaTorah, this week's Parsha, Parshas Chukas. Ke'esrim v'arba kroinos maleim sifrei Talmud, 24 wagons full of Gemara, as was pointed out before, manuscripts. This is not printed. Each one of these had to be commissioned and written by hand. You know how hard it is to write a Sefer Torah? So a Shas is much longer than a Sefer Torah. Okay, and all of that effort, halachas hagadis nisrfu. This doesn't mean Haggadah Shal Pesach. This means Sifrei Haggadah, like Midrashim and the like. Nisrfu b'tzarfas were burnt in France. Kasher shamanu l'shema oizen, as we heard. Then he goes on and says further. V'gan min harabanim shahayu sham, and from the rabbis who were there, shamanu, we heard from them. Sha'asu she'elas chalem. They did a she'elas chalem. What's a she'elas chalem? She'elas Chalim is very interesting, and in this time in Ashkenaz, it's happening a lot. She'elas Chalim is, you go to sleep with a question, usually a halachic question, and you get your answer in a dream. Now this is a whole fascinating topic, because usually we're taught that halacha, Torah lo b'shemaimi, halacha has to be based on seichel. So are you allowed to go to sleep and get an answer from heaven and paskin based on that? Oh, it's a fascinating topic. The Sfardim, they didn't do this. You do not find the Nigla people in Sfard doing this. The Mekubalim did. But the Ashkenazim, the regular Nigla, the Paiskim, the Halachist, all engaged in this. In fact, we mentioned before Rabbi Yechiel of Kutzi. Rabbi Yechiel of Kutzi changed things in his Sefer, and how he counted the 630 mitzvahs based on a dream that he had. And he reports, first of all, he reports that he wrote his Sefer because of the dream that he had, and he changed how he calculated the 630 mitzvahs based on a dream that he had. So this is very, very common at this time. Here they do a Sheilas Chalim. What was the Shaila? Ladas in Gzeirahi Meis Haboira. They wanted to know, is this a Gzeira from Hashem? Now, this is a little bit of... This is a little bit of a funny question. What does it mean in Gzeirahi Meis Haboira? What does that mean? Everything is Meis Haboira. So we'll come back to that in a second. What were we saying?
Did they forbid them from learning the Talmud?
Yeah. So not only are they taking the Gemara away, there's also a ban against Talmud study that stays on for a number of years until they come back and say, okay, you could learn Gemara, but you need to take out the problematic passages, and that happened a few years later. Ve'yeshiva lehem. So what was the answer in the dream? 3 words. V'da gzeiras oiraisa. This is the Gzeira of the Torah, which is Targum Onkelos, the Targum of the word Zois Chukas HaTorah is Da Gzeira Saraisa, which Pashas meant, you asked, is this Gzeira Meis HaBoira? Is this God's decree? Answer, Zois Chukas HaTorah. It's the Torah's decree. Upirushai, he adds here a very interesting line, meaning, B'yoyim Vav Zois Chukas HaTorah Hi HaGzeira. Not only the answer from heaven was, yes, it's a Gzeira, but he gives here a line that many have struggled to understand exactly what he means over here. But it's also when the Gzeira is going to be during the Parsha of Zayis Chukas HaTorah. It's going to be, that's when the event is going to happen, which we know happened. It happened on the Friday of that Parsha.
They add the vav to Vida. It says does.
You're saying the Vav?
Yeah, dog there Satorah. Zayis Chukas HaTorah would be da. Vida.
Interesting. You're saying the added Vav, Vida, that added Vav meant that it was going to be on the Friday of Gzeira Saraisa. Okay, that's good. That's good. I like that. That's good. I like that. Okay, so again, there's 2 answers again in the dream. Number 1, you asked if this is a Gzeira. Yes. Number 2, when is the Gzeira going to play out? On Friday of Parshas Chukas. And from that day, Kavu ha-yichidim alayam li'is anois boy. The deal yichidim. It does not become a communal fast. If you remember, we spoke about Chav Sivan. There was a communal fast. This did not, but yichidim. Yichidim took this on as a fast. To fast when? B'chol shav shana b'yoyim shishi shal parsha zayis chukas haTorah. V'lai kavu b'li mei hachodesh. Usually we have a fast when? On the 17th of the month, on the 9th of a month, on the 10th of a month. Everything goes by the month. This not. This goes by the week. Why? Well, because they gave an answer, Zois Chukas HaTorah, that yes, it's a Gzeira, so Mamish invokes Parshas Shavuot, and Arachas Kavakama, that they were given a day when it's going to happen, so it made so much sense to fast on that day. And so you ended up having this fast. How long did people fast over here? Well, we already know. Ma'ada Chav Sivan, which in the time of the Rishonim was a communal fast, dissipated, so how much more so this also eventually dissipated as well. One of the people who was present at this time was Maram Rothenburg. Maram Rothenburg later lived in Germany, which is further east. But at this time he was in France, and he was a student of Rabbi Yechiel of Paris, and he became later one of the most famous Rabbanim and Poskim of his era. And he wrote a liturgical dirge, a piyut, about this event. And we'll see that in a second. But before we get there, one more point about the question that I asked a moment ago. What does it mean? Let us check out if this is a Gzeira Momaila. What does that even mean? So the truth is that we have another piyut that we say that has the same words. This is the Asara Rugei Malchos. And we say this on every Yom Kippur in Musaf and Davening. We can't go too much into detail in the Asara Rugei Malchos now. But what happens is that the king, the Roman emperor, is presented as telling the rabbis they need to die to atone for the sin of selling Yosef into slavery. So they tell him, Zmantna lanu shloisha yamim, give us 3 days, ad sheneda in nigzar hadavar mimiroimim, until we know if this is decreed from above. So again, what does that mean? He already told you, you're chayav. So what does it mean? Let's go above to find out in nigzar hadavar mimiroimim. I'm making this a big question. I don't think it's such a big question. I just didn't see many people addressing it. I think the answer is, there's two types of things, Maila. There's a Gzeira and there's a Kitrug, to use more Chassidus language. A Gzeira means this is what's happening and there's nothing you can do to change it. That's a Gzeira. A Kitrug is, the Alter Rebbe isn't Tfisa because Lamaila, it's happened. Is it Lamaila? Yes, Lamaila. But it wasn't predetermined and destined. There's nothing to do to get the Alter Rebbe out of prison. The Alter Rebbe was put into prison because of the Kitrug. So something was cooking, but the outcome is not predetermined yet. So it looks like they were asking, in both cases, is this a Gzeira, in which case there's nothing we can do, not Begashmis and not Beruchnis, to change the situation. So okay, then we'll embrace our fate, because Ema Lasot. But if what we find out is that rather than a Gzeira, this is just a Kitrug, so a Kitrug you could overcome. A Kitrug, Torah, Tefillah, Tzedakah, Ruchnis, Gashmis, who knows, many different things you could do. So it seems like that's what was happening over here, and they reached their conclusion that there's nothing they could do about it. Now back to Maram Rottenberg, he wrote a piyut about what he observed, and this is recited in the Kinnos on Tisha B'Av toward the end. Basically, the way the Kinnos on Tisha B'Av are set up, as you all learned in camp, you went through the Kinnos in depth and thoroughly, so you know all the Kinnos very well. So basically, the last 9 Kinnos are all Tzion Kinnosim. They're all Tzion Kinnos. What does that mean? They begin with the word Tzion, and that's the last 9, including the last one, which is Eli Tzion Ve'orel, which also, so this is like its own category of Tzion Kinnos. Somewhere within that order, I don't remember, somewhere within those 9, you have this piyut that does not have the word Tzion in it, that is Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh. It's written by Maram Rottenberg, and we're going to go through a few of the lines. Here's the opening line. It says as follows: Sha'ali Srufa Ba'esh L'shloim Avelaich. He who was burnt in fire, seek out and ask about the well-being of the people who are mourning you. Hamisavim Shchoin Bachatzar Zivuloich, who desire, who have a taiva to dwell in the courtyard of your dwelling place. If you just read this line, there's something that has been burnt by fire. But you could say, okay, that's Yerushalayim, right? You're asking Yerushalayim, the Yerushalayim should say, no, how are you then doing? But as you'll see, as he moves, the beginning is vague, what he's talking about, and it could be, each verse and line could be Yerushalayim, could be something else, but then as the piyut moves along, it becomes clearer and clearer what he's talking about. Go to the next line. Eicha nesuna be'esh oichla. How could that which was given in a consuming fire, Torah was given ba'esh, right? Matan Torah happened with fire. So Torah is Nesuna be'esh oichla. So how could that which was Nesuna be'esh oichla, how could it be te'ukal be'esh basar? How could it be consumed by human fire? V'loi nichvu zvarim begachaloich. And these foreigners weren't burnt themselves by your coal. In other words, Torah is fire. The second they touched it, they should have gone up in flame. This has a strong, this is a lament, this is a taina that he's having to Hashem. How is this even possible? Look at the next line. The next line, I'm obviously skipping over here, but the next line has a certain level of like audacity to it almost. Sinai, he turns to Har Sinai. Halachem b'cha b'char elikim? Is that why God chose you? Umas b'gdoilim, but spurned the larger mountains, v'zarach b'gvuloyach, and shone specifically over you. Why did Hashem choose a small mountain? We say, oh, we know Hashem chose a small mountain for this reason, that reason. So now he's asking rhetorically, maybe the reason why you were chosen, liyais lemoifis ledas, because that would be symbolic of the fact that Torah would be kisismayat, that Torah would one day become small and short and diminish, v'seidid mikvoida, and it would be diminished from its glory. V'hein emshal mishalayich, let me tell you a mashal, Sinai. Mashal amelech, there's a king, asher bachal mishtevnoi, though he's marrying off his son, he's crying. Safa, why? Because he realized Asher Yigva, his son is one day going to die. So Kainat b'miloich, that's what's happening here. Har Sinai was small because Hashem saw that this in the year 1242 or 1244 is going to happen. And so is that why the Har Sinai is chosen? This is like a little gutsy. Look, he goes weiter. I will, tears will flow until they become like a stream. V'yagiu likivroi shnei sarei atiloich, and they'll reach the graves of the 2 ministers of Moshe v'Aaron b'hor hahar. I assume you read it like this: Moshe wherever he's buried, v'Aaron b'hor hahar. I think because we don't know where Moshe is buried. V'esha. So my tears are going to reach them, and then I will ask: Hayesh Torah chadasha? B'chein nisrafu gliloich? Is there a new Torah? Is that why the scrolls have been burnt? This is a very, very, very audacious line, because yes, there were people alive. Those who burnt it said that there was a Torah chadasha.
and Jews are always arguing, saying, no, there isn't a Torah Chadasha. And so I'm going to ask Moshe and Aaron, well, if this was burnt, is there a Torah Chadasha? Esma lanafshi, I wondered to myself, how could food be sweet for me? After seeing that they took the booty, meaning this important chashve thing, to the street, kinidachas, just like an ir nidachas, where you're supposed to bring all the possessions out. One of the punishments for the ir nidachas, you take all their possessions and burn it. V'sarfu shlal oyin, and they burnt this supernal loot, which is a good thing. Meaning shlal is a chashva thing. Asher timas lavai ka'aloich, and who burnt it? The people who have been rejected from becoming, being accepted into the Jewish community. This is a reference to Nicholas. So these are just a small taste of this piyut that he wrote, and Minig Yisrael has been to recite this every year on Tisha B'Av. So while the fast has disappeared, the piyut has remained with us, and that's the small memory that we still have of this event in our communities today. Now, the fast did come back. Just briefly, Gzeres Tachvatat Chamelitsky in 1648, we spoke about it. And I showed you then how Chaf Sivan came back to life because there were 3 reasons the Shach gave. We're not going to go through it again. And Chaf Sivan was chosen to become a Tainus. The Magen Avram says that there were some people who chose to fast on Friday Chukas. Why? Because there was once upon a time an old fast, and there was a Crusader big attacks that happened in 2 cities on that day, Friday of Chukas, and so therefore there were some people who brought the fast back. But again, that didn't last. Too long. 2 more small nakutas. Number 1, causes. Anytime you have a tragedy that befalls the Jewish people, there's always a chance that someone's going to say it happened because of X. And this definitely happened then. We probably don't have a record of most of those conversations, but we have a record of one. The event that we spoke about occurred between 1240, 1242, 1244. A few years earlier, there was a major dispute in the Jewish community about the Sfarim of the Rambam. And we spoke about this at a different opportunity. Suffice it to say for here, that there were people who were not happy with the Rambam's Mor Nevuchim. They were not happy with his Sefer Amada. And they told Christians that there are problems in this book. This happened in southern France. And the Christians came, took these Sfarim, and burnt them. This happened in the year 1232 or 1233, I don't remember. So it happened 7 or 8 years before this. Now, there were people who were against the Rambam's approach. Maybe they didn't advocate for the Sfarim to be burnt, but there were people who were very against the Rambam's approach. There were people who were very for the Rambam's approach, and obviously, the people who were for the Rambam's approach said, aha, you know why the Gemaras in France were burnt? Because you guys, a few years before, you burned the Rambam Sfarim. So this is the oynish that you're getting. Now, where does this come from? There's a letter from a man by the name of Rabbi Yechiel of Verona. Rabbi Yechiel of Verona lived, during this period. Generally, the dates that they give for him are from 1220 to 1295. So he's living through this very period. He wrote a long letter. He's very strong, a defender of the Rambam. He's a chassid of the Rambam. And he writes in his account that this is the reason for the sin. And then in the second paragraph, he writes, V'im tisha, and this is the reason for the burning. And then he says, V'im tisha, if you ask, Mi oideya, she'oisam agzeiros hayu ba'ova in serfes hamada v'amero. Who tells you? How do I know? Encha, I'll tell you. Hine ois v'amoifes. Here's the sign. Sh'layifsiku mem yoim ben sreifa sifra rabbeinu serfes sifra Talmud. Because it was not even 40 days between the 2 events. Okay. Even from the Jewish sources that we have that talk about the Rambam's thing, put it 7 or 8 years earlier. So we don't really understand exactly what he means by that. Then he says further, and the burning happened in the same place in Paris. That's another problem. We know from the Jewish sources that the burning of the Rambam happened in Provence, in Montpellier, not in Paris. It's very, very far away. Okay. And then he goes further. Yes, it was. Maybe. And the ashes of the 2 books mixed together. Because the ash was still there. And everyone knows this. And then everyone realized that the way I understand this is
it's not important, these specific details. What's important here is that there was one Jew, and there wasn't only one Jew, there were many Jews who linked the two events. 40 days, not 40 days, same place, not the same place. There were people who said that, well, one second, you could even explain it logically. Oh, we could burn Jewish books, Rambam, so what? So that opens the door to other things. You could explain it spiritually. Yeah, if you did that, then this is Hashem's Nakama. Okay, whatever it is, this is one. Were there other things that Jews were discussing at the time? Possibly. We don't have such a good record about it. Now, what happened was, just to conclude the stories we mentioned before, eventually they said, okay, you could learn Gemara, you just have to excise the passages, but ultimately the Jews were expelled from France. Not too long after this, the expulsion from France happened, I think, in 1306, so it wasn't so much later that anyway Jews weren't living there and they had to live elsewhere. So come back to the beginning where we spoke about the statue. So now King Louis was the one who accepted the letter of the Pope. He's the only king who acted on it, who set up the commission, and we're the only king under whose jurisdiction the Gemara was burnt. He did other things, but this is the most famous of the things that he did against the Jewish people. So where does that leave for the statue? I don't know. I don't care. I don't have any thoughts on that. Now I want to leave.
The papacy was in Paris, actually.
What was that?
There was a period where the papacy was in Paris.
Avignon,
It
not
was that
Paris.
time, no?
Avignon,
Oh,
not
Avignon,
Paris.
France.
That's in southern France. Okay. One more point for a conclusion. In the Sikha, the Shloshim, after the Rebbetzin passed away, in Tavshim Mem Ches. So this is Chaf Aleph Adar, Chaf Beis Adar, I don't remember. It was Parshas Parah then. And so the Rebbe spoke about this week's Parsha, Zois Chukas HaTorah. And the Rebbe basically said the following. What is Parshas Chukas about? What is Parshas Parah about? It's about overcoming Tumas Meis. Okay? So you can look at it very legalistically. What does that mean? You're Tameh. You go through the process of the Parah Aduma, now you're not Tameh anymore. Okay, very good. But look at it also a little more conceptually. Death happened. That's a certain trauma for a person. And then there's a time when you get over it. And that's what's happening in Parshas Chukas. There's the death, there's the mourning, there's the sadness, there's the trauma. And then Taras Hapara, the idea that you could become pure represents the idea you could overcome that loss. You could overcome that suffering. You could move on. You could grow. You could become better. Fine. So the Rebbe said, Oy bazoi, why is it that we say that a chayk is something that we don't understand? We say para aduma is something that we don't understand. We don't appreciate. That sounds like to be a different narrative. Here, the Rebbe just finished saying that the whole story of para aduma is all about you don't get it. It doesn't work with you. You don't understand it. You're traumatized, and then you get healing. What do you mean you get healing? The whole point of paraduma, another message we learn about paraduma is as mefashteit nish b'chlal. No one can understand it. Even the smartest people don't understand it. It's a classic chayk. So what did the Rebbe explain? The Rebbe explains both are true. Why? Because as much as you understand and as much as you move away from mourning and you move away from sadness, at the end of the day, there's something that's going to bother you. There's something that's not there. There's something that's not going to resonate with you. And that's a reality. And as long as you're trying to overcome it and push yourself past it, so then you're fine and you're good. And therefore you shouldn't feel down when you realize you're trying. You said, Torah says Shloshim is over. So I want to move post Shloshim, but I'm not emotionally ready. Yeah, it's going to be a struggle. You have the koyach, but it's not always going to be 100%. It's a fascinating sikha. Look at it. So I'm just saying, in this context, because Zois Chukas HaTorah plays such a big role over here, the Tara overcoming the loss, that definitely happened. In terms of overcoming the loss of Sreifas HaTalmud, we overcame that. In other words, the Gemara wasn't lost, and we're learning it, and we're still learning it today. We complete the Taras Hapara, the idea of, yes, a loss happened, but we can completely overcome it, that has happened in this regard. But at the same time, the question lingers about the fact that our ancestors had to go through that suffering, and that question is always going to remain unanswered, at least till Mashiach comes, because for them, it must have been extremely traumatic. And Baruch Hashem that we don't have to live through that.